Good evening. My name is Danny Eller, and I'll be talking today to you about the history and development of Wesley Chapel, Florida. Down the lower right, you'll see a border map of Wesley Chapel. That's I-70, 75 freeway in the yellow you see going down through it. First, I'd like to talk to you about the pioneers that moved into the area. When people think of pioneers, they think of people that expand out to the west. After all, St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West, and a lot of pioneers kicked off from there. And before there, it was going into the Appalachian Mountains, into the wilderness. Well, down here in Florida, we have a lot of wilderness. It was wilderness then, and it's quite a bit of it still today. And pioneers moved down into Florida primarily for land. Now, in the 1840s, the state became Florida became a state in 1845, but they needed people to come down before the place could become the area could become a state. So they passed a law called the Armed Occupation Act of August 4th, 1842. And what that did was that granted land of 160 acres. Anybody would come down, cultivate the land, build a house, and defend it from Indian attacks. Now, the reason I say Indian attacks because it's actually referred to as that in the act itself. Um, we're talking about hostile native tribes of the area, of course. Uh, Landowner owner would receive a deed after 5 years of doing this and maintaining his residence on there and keeping the cultivation of the land going. During that time period, some of these pioneers they formed the double branch congregation Baptist congregation in 1878. That later turned into what we now know today as Wesley Chapel. The pioneers, they were several families like the Boyettes, Gillettes, Godwins, and the Kersey families. They're the ones that came down here and actually hacked this area out of the wilderness. They did farms, hog farms, ranches for cattle, citrus trees, all kinds of other produce. They uh, cultivated in this area. The pioneers built a community during this time period. Mary Mary Jane Godwin, in 1984, she applied for a 160-acre homestead along what is now State Road 54, and then it was called Hernando County. Hernando County in 1887 split the southern half, becoming Pasco County, which Wesley Chapel is in. During that time, Mary Godwin deeded 3 acres to the Wesley Chapel. One was for the cemetery, and that picture up there is her grave marker where she died in 1911. She's buried in that cemetery that she deeded to the city for the use of a cemetery, a Baptist church next door, and next door to that, a school. Um, the Baptist Church has the responsibility of caring for and managing the cemetery that she's buried in. Wesley Chapel Church was a Methodist congregation. Um, they Wesley Chapel was known as that, got its name from that in 1888. Even though the church itself was not built until 1890, just like the Double Branch Baptist community, they were most likely meeting in other homes of the area, and that's how that area of along State Road 54 picked up the name of Wesley Chapel, and that stuck for eventually became the town's name. Now the town was known by other names. It was known as Godwin, and that's after the Godwin family. It was also known as by some people as Boyette. Again, that was after pioneer family Boyette. It was known as Wesley because initially the federal post office, rejected the name Wesley Chapel, although it's called Wesley Chapel today. and they recognized it as that. It was also known as Gatorville, and that was because of the abundance of gators, alligators that live in the area even to this day. I live not far from where all this took place. So you see these pictures, and I have a large uh, pond in the back behind my house, along with the conservation area. And I myself will not go out at night into my own backyard because I frankly am a little hesitant to do so with all the critters out there, to include the alligators. The church, the Wesley Chapel church itself, was a wood construction and it burned down. It wasn't really up for more than a year. It burned down. It was never rebuilt after the 1891 fire. Now, the Double Branch Baptist Church, it became the center of the community. They were all located very close to each other. And again, it was built at the same time the Wesley Chapel Church, Methodist Church, was in 1890. And again, it was from that donation of land from Mary Godwin that I've already talked about. It was renamed First Baptist Church of Wesley Chapel in 1999. And Wesley Chapel School was on that third acre. Now, it was granted to or deeded to the Wesley Chapel community by Mary Godwin in 1890, 91. There's some differences on the records there. But the classes were going on in that area prior to that, several years prior to that. And Mary Godwin is listed, Mary Jane Godwin is listed as trustee and as a part-time teacher there. She was known to have taught some classes there at time. The school operated until 1951. There was some controversy the last couple of years it was in existence about the effectiveness of the teacher. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and it was dissolved in that year, 1951. And the property eventually was purchased by the Double Branch Baptist Church, where it remains today part of that church property. Currently, there are 5 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, 2 high schools: Wiregrass Ranch High School, Wesley Chapel High School, and 1 state college named Pasco Hernando State College. It's a 4-year school, Porter campus, and I'll go into why it's called Porter in just a moment. Nearby Zephyr Hills, we can't really talk about Wesley Chapel unless we discuss Zephyr Hills. It was the hub of this area. Early on, it was initially called Abbott, but later changed to Zephyr Hills when it was established in the late 1860s after the Civil War by Civil War veterans. They got a rail line. Rail line was built by a Henry Platt that out of Plant City, Florida, and he's the one who built the railroads up and through here along the lines of 301. Pretty generally speaking, along the lines of Highway 301, which followed the line of military roads that went from military bases, army bases from Tampa all the way up through the middle of the state, up to Fort King, which was up by Dade City, Fort Dade City. And they built these forts along this road, this military road, at a day's march, so that by the time they take off in the morning, that they'd be in a guarded compound for defense against the hostile natives, which they were pretty hostile at the time. We had 2 Seminole Wars prior to 1850, and that really caused a lot of that to go on in order to pacify the local native tribes. They built roads and the forts to support the immigration of people coming down from the United States and from other places as well. Zephyr Hills had a downturn in the 60s and 70s. I-75 was built 15 miles west of Wesley Chapel. Wesley Chapel also had a downturn during that time period. Let me go back up and talk about the train depot. Like I said, it initially was named Abbott, and in 1927, the train depot. You see the picture there. It was built, and it was both for cargo and passenger service. Um, it went out of business in the 60s, 1960s, and was later purchased by the city of Zephyr Hills and is now a train depot museum. Rough times hit in Wesley Chapel during the Prohibition era. When Prohibition took place in January 1920, the local people were pretty independent people, the pioneer families. They didn't take well to it. They had voted against Prohibition in various other elections prior to the national prohibition in 1920. Um, they there was a lot of because of that there was a lot of moonshine going on. There was a depressed time period for this area, and people turned to moonshine because they had all the things to make it. They had all the equipment, they had the knowledge, they had the area to they could do it without too many prying eyes. Um, they had citrus for all the different types of brandy. They had the grains. They had all the materials they need, and they knew they had the know-how, and they also had the independent thinking that it would take for that kind of activity. Right there, you see one of the reports. This is just one of numerous uh, reports out of the Dade City Banner and the Tampa Bay newspapers, Petersburg newspapers of things like you see there going on with them, the moonshine. That picture is from Hillsborough County. It was taken in Hillsborough County by when the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department was able to catch a big haul of moonshine being brought in from Wesley Chapel. I think that picture was 1933 or sometime around that time period, 1930s. Now, we can't talk about Wesley Chapel unless we discuss at length James Wiregrass Porter. James Wiregrass Porter, he got the name Wiregrass because of a local Buick dealer in Dade City that was a friend of his, sent him a postcard and addressed it Wiregrass Porter, Gatorville, Florida, USA. The man was in Mexico when he sent the postcard to his friend, James Porter. It actually arrived and it caused quite a stir, and James Porter was always known as Wiregrass Porter from that time period. This His friend would send him a book of matches for Christmas and quite often, and would always give him the instructions to burn the wiregrass because it made good fertilizer for the grasslands for the cattle. And so that's how that all started with him being known as Wiregrass Porter. That's also what he called his ranch. He's the one that started Wiregrass Ranch. Uh, he came up to the area from Plant City, which is east of Tampa, and he came up into Zephyr Hills initially, where he bought 1,200 acres. However, not too soon after he bought it, the Army Air Corps came in and confiscated the land to build an airfield and fighter pilot training facility in World War II. He then moved on in 1946 and bought 14,000 acres in Wesley Chapel, and he established that ranch, Wesley Wiregrass Ranch. Now, James Porter is very important because what he did was, like Mary Godwin before him, he would donate land for the community's betterment. And he would also sell land for just specific use. If you were going to come in and buy it and put up something he didn't agree with, he wouldn't sell it to you. But If you wanted to build something, he would sell you the land normally at a very good price because he wanted the certain things built in the area to bring the community up. Uh, James Porter died in 2003 at the age of 86. His family, the Porter family, has continued on with his philanthropy. Pardon me, philanthropy and helping the community, I should say. Um, the Porter family has donated all kinds of lands, like for Wiregrass High School, Pasco Hernando State College, that's called the Porter campus, and I'll go into that a little bit more. The Florida Hospital, Wesley Chapel Sports Park, and in addition to that, he sold land for to Saddlebrook Resort to uh, bring in that into what was then at that time in 1979 kind of a depressed area, and the shops at Wiregrass Outdoor Mall. That picture you see is the last up in the top right is the last remaining barracks from the Army Air Corps facility. It's now a museum. You see the World War II transport plane, the C-47 Dakota behind it. Um, that's still here. That airfield that was built on his initial 1,200 acres is still there, uh, being used as a municipal airport. Wesley Chapel is one of the fastest community growing communities in the entire state of Florida. We have the Saddlebrook Resort that was started, like I said, in 1979. You have Pasco Hernando State College Porter campus. Beautiful campus. It was built-in parking garage, which really comes in handy with some of the severe thunderstorms we have, and also some of the direct sunlight that can heat up cars down here pretty to pretty bad levels. The shops at Wiregrass. It's an outdoor mall, just absolutely beautiful, and it's not too far from where James Porter had his initial house he moved into, which was an um, old moonshiner's shack. And that shack is located actually where the hospital now, which is not too far from the mall, just very close to the mall, almost next to it. Um, where that hospital was built, it's only been open about 2 years, and they are now have a very large expansion going on to it being built right now. Uh, because of all this expansion, the major roads in the area, most of the roads, have been widened from 2 to 4 and 6 lane roads. They are still being expanded throughout the area. We have dozens of major retail outlets. There will be opening soon a very large outlet mall opening here before Christmas of this year. We have uh, we have car dealerships that have opened. We have Mercedes, BMW, Mini, Mazda, Ford, Chevrolet, Toyota, Nissan, Hyundai. We have all these car dealerships, and within just a mile or two of the city uh, borders, we have Buick, Dodge, Jeep, several others, GMC, several other automobile dealers just outside of Wesley Chapel. So the place is really growing, and the reason it's growing, it goes back to the pioneer families, Mary Jane Godwin and her donation of land to the community for the use of the use as a central focus point for the community, cemetery, uh, church, which is also was also the community center and also a school. And then we have Cracker, like James Porter. By the way, Crackers is what you call a Florida cowboy because they came down, escaped slaves, Northern and Union and Confederate soldiers that deserted, come down. They worked on the ranches, and they used these whips that made the cracking noise, and they became known as crackers. James Porter came from that. He was a cracker. He was a cattleman, and he's the one that made that Wiregrass Ranch and then used that valuable land to better the community, to help out in getting these facilities for everyone's use to be built. Now, here is my bibliography. If you look on here, a couple of these I had on my project paper about this subject. I didn't have them referenced in the paper itself, but this one I was actually talking about these. So these are links and the sources to those things that I discussed in my paper. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and have learned something about it. Now you know when you hear Tampa that they've got a beautiful community right north of it called Wesley Chapel, and maybe you might want to stop in now that you know a little bit about the history of the area. Uh, Hope you have a good night. This is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you.